of Scripture, but never that there were too many comma splices. I'll put that down. So today, maybe you remember last week, today is the last installment of our story series. I'm going to be away the next few weeks. Next week, participating in the wedding of a colleague from seminary, and after that on a bit of vacation. I think it's been, I don't know about you, I think it's been a fun summer together exploring parts of the Bible we don't normally frequent. To me, in the preparation of it, it's felt a little bit like stops at quirky roadside attractions, on your family trip. Now, if you've been here all along, you know that we've hit up stories about beautiful queens, revenge plots, road trips, dogs, husband-eating demons, mischievous prophets who won't do what they're told, talking donkeys, and we're going to close it out today with murderous widows. So, woo, to go along with the thunder. Today, as Darcy mentioned, it's another story from the Apocrypha, that strange middle section that exists in some Bibles but not others. Again, in case you missed it, these are works that historically belong in the Old Testament. They come before the time of Jesus, but because they were written in Greek, linguistically they belong with the New Testament, and Martin Luther and his buds did not like that, so they threw them out of almost all Protestant Bibles, which is why you've probably never heard of Judith before from the pulpit, so you are in luck today. And one more note before we go any further. Judith is an ahistorical story, meaning it's not possible to pin down at a particular place along the timeline of biblical history. We say this because it includes historical details from a 5-century-long period of Israelite history and also references people and places that are clearly fictional. Thus, it is a tale that exists outside of time, like some others we find in the Bible, Jonah, Ruth, and Esther. It's a story meant to tell us about, to use that wonderful turn of phrase from the late Marcus Borg, things that are true, some of which actually happened. So let's just begin this way. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. At least that was true for King Nebuchadnezzar, that is, the tyrant who reigned much of the Mediterranean during the 6th century BCE, whose rule is like a backdrop for this curious story. It was the best of times because Nebuchadnezzar had just completed an epic conquest of the neighboring territory of Medes, soundly defeating his rival and expanding not only his territory, but also his reputation to a great degree. And there had been rejoicing and feasting in the capital city of Nineveh, which you may remember from Jonah. But as the king sat contemplating his great victory, his thoughts turned to more troubling realities. You see, in the height of the battle, when things had not looked so assured, Nebuchadnezzar had called for reinforcements from the vassal nations surrounding his empire, and they had not come. In fact, they had refused to come, sending Nebuchadnezzar's messengers back alone and in disgrace. And this fact had Nebuchadnezzar very troubled. It was the worst of times, really, because it meant that his subjects did not fear him. And for an emperor, that was very, very bad news. Empires thrive on fear, and if you don't have any, it's difficult to manage your subjects. And so Nebuchadnezzar devised a plan to punish these insubordinates and to remind them of their place. So he called his general, Holofernes, to him and explained that he was sending him out into the surrounding lands to teach those people a lesson. And Holofernes was to kill, pillage, and burn as many villages as he was able to until such time as everyone came to their senses. And he did exactly that. And man, it did not take long before the surrounding territories cried out for mercy, surrendering themselves into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar and promising that they would never, ever, 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 ever fail to respond to their master's command again. And they welcomed Holofernes into their villages with garlands and tambourines and festivals, and he was very gracious. He did spare their lives, but he pressed on in his campaign to destroy most of their religious sites and temples, assuring that henceforth they could worship only the emperor. But not everyone, as it turned out, was open to such coerced religious conversion. There was a small and insignificant band of folks ensconced in the hill country who heard of Holofernes and his campaign and banded together to say, "Not in our house." And of course, these were the Israelites. Rather than sending sheepish emissaries to Holofernes begging for peace, the people of Judea prepared for war. They seized the hilltop fortresses, fortified the mountain villages, stored up food, and closed all the routes through the hills which led to the capital city of Jerusalem, in which their holy temple stood. And all the people of Israel humbled themselves and put on sackcloth and fasted and offered sacrifices and prayed that God might protect them. And in those prayers, they prayed especially for the mountain village of Bethulia, because it was the one closest to the plain in which the armies of Holofernes had drawn up. And when Holofernes heard about that, he was perplexed. "Who are they?" he said. "Who are the Israelites?" He had never heard of them. And so he summoned some local army officers to fill him in, and one among these, Achior of the Ammonites, came forward to give some background on the history of Israel, which you too can read in the entire the Old Testament, but we don't have time for that today. So just insert here the entire history of the Old Testament. But the most important thing to note for our purposes is, along with details of Israel's history, Achior gave Holofernes an ominous proclamation. These people, he said, the Jews, they are in relationship with a powerful God, a God who will protect them as long as they are faithful. Now, if they fall into sin, that is one thing, and there's a chance we could succeed against them. But as long as they are obedient to God, God will defend them, and it would be better for us to pass them by. And that did not suit Holofernes' ego at all. And so he had Achior tied up and thrown outside the city gates of Bethulia, where the next morning the Jews came and willingly brought him into the fortress. And he shared with them Holofernes' plan. Though they were very worried about this evil plot, they remained steadfast in their belief that God would protect them, right up until the water ran out. You see, Holofernes was a little bloodthirsty and egotistical, but he was actually also very shrewd. And he had figured out that all the water for this town flowed through one particular spring that was outside the city gates. So he captured the spring, rightly figuring if his army could not defeat them, at least it could cause them to die of thirst instead. And indeed, the Jews of Bethulia did get very thirsty. After a few days, their cisterns were empty, and their citizens were listless and weak, and their resolve began to fail. They grumbled to their leaders, demanding that they surrender the city rather than die within it. And then Uzziah, kind of like the chair of the city council of Bethulia, made the following statement: "Let's give it 5 more days." More accurately, he said, "Let's give God 5 more days. And if God doesn't save us in 5 days, then we'll surrender." And this sounded okay to most of the people because they were very thirsty, and so they went home to wait 5 days. But it did not sit at all well with the city's most respected and most wealthy and most faithful and most beautiful widow, Judith. Now, Judith had had a husband, Manasseh, who had been a good and wealthy man, but he succumbed to heat stroke in the barley harvest and left her with land, wealth, servants, and a whole lot of sadness. She was in mourning for years, wearing her mourning clothes every single day except on holidays. And she was known by all to be fair and faithful and wise, and so the fact that she did not approve of the city council's plan was not good news. And Judith, as we just heard Darcy read, summoned all the council members to the house, if only that was a possibility today, and asked them in not uncertain terms, "What on earth are you thinking?" She told them, "It is very foolish to put God to the test, to give God ultimatums. God is God," she reminded them, "not a human whose whims are so easily shaped by present crises. Salvation," she said, "will come by God's choice, not by our own manipulation." And with that, she concluded with this: "But since you've already gone and messed everything up so much, you might as well just stand back and I'm going to fix it." And they did, and she did, and here's how that happened. First, she went and prayed. It's always a great place to begin, right? She went and prayed, and she got all her maids to pray with her, and then she took off her mourning clothes and she put on a party dress, obviously. And she did her hair, and she put on her best jewelry, and she put on a little makeup. And then she put some provisions in a bag, like some Gatorade, granola bars or something. And she and her maid went out the front city gates. They slipped out in the night, and they went right for the enemy camp. Now, of course, when they were confronted by the patrol at the edge of the camp, Judith batted her eyes, and she said in her most melodious voice, "Oh, please help me, won't you? I'm fleeing Bethulia because the people there are about to sin to save themselves, eating meat designated for sacrifice, and I just can't be party to that. Please take me to your commander so that I can give him a report of what I know." And they were captivated by Judith's beauty and her amazing faithfulness, and so the patrol did exactly what she asked. And so she went in, she met the great Holofernes, and she told them just what she told the patrol. The people of Bethulia were about to sin in order to save themselves. And wouldn't the great, powerful, strong, intelligent, amazing, handsome General Holofernes please help her make her escape? Maybe she could stay in his camp, she suggested. If only he would allow her to go out each night and bathe and say her prayers, she would be very comfortable with all these strong, smart, manly men around. And Holofernes said, "That sounds like a great idea." He was excited not only by all the possibilities Judith's presence suggested, but also at the same moment by the military advancement that now seemed almost on his doorstep. So he allowed her to stay and rest in the camp, and each night for the few nights they went outside in the evening to pray, and then they came back. And after a while, Holofernes thought, well, since we have a beautiful woman in our camp, we might as well, invite her to dinner and just sort of see what happens. And so he threw a great banquet, and he ate and drank, and he enjoyed Judith's delightful company, and he ate and drank more, and he ate and drank more, and he ate and drank more, and in fact, he drank more than he had ever drunk in a single day since his birth. And after that, he stumbled to his chamber, and he asked if Judith would like to accompany him there, and she agreed, and they went into his tent, and they shut the flaps. This is all in the Bible. I'm not making this up. But unfortunately for Holofernes, he had drank too much of drink to do anything really interesting, and he passed out on top of a huge pile of rugs. And Judith quickly took his giant sword from where it was hanging on the wall and chopped his head off and put his head in her purse. And then she snuck out into the night, and she summoned her maid, and they left the camp, and the guards had seen them do this before, and so believed they were going out to pray and didn't think a bit about it. But the women left and fled all the way back to Bethulia, and Judith summoned all the city councilmen and said, "I have here in my purse the head of Holofernes, so get ready for battle." And they did. And they marched out against the Assyrians. And the Assyrian soldiers, who were so confused by this strategic development, ran into the tent to find their master, and instead found his body without a head lying on his bed, and they were thrown into great confusion. And the Israelites marched against them and overtook them, and the Assyrians were scattered and they retreated. And there was a great celebration in all the land of Israel. And after they had plundered the encampment, Judith led the whole village in a raucous dance party. And she sang a song of celebration that went something like, "Let's celebrate! An evil man was cut down today at the hand of a woman, no less. Huzzah!" The second verse was, "Let's celebrate that God has been with us again when we were tested. Huzzah!" And the third verse was something like, "Let's celebrate that our God is a God not of the many, but of the few, not of the mighty, but of the weak, the helper of the oppressed, the protector of the forsaken. Let's celebrate, because no one will ever forget this story." And they didn't, except for the Protestants. But we're making good on that now. The end. So that's the story of Judith. It's another one that's not too familiar to us, but as all good stories, I think, offers yet another window through which we can look at the world and at ourselves. Now, of course, we have to recognize it's a story of its own time. It's a worldview limited by the boundaries of knowledge as they existed when it was written. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've appreciated the witness of Judith, and come to see that it is, among many other things, a commentary on the relationship between citizenship and faith. I mean, think about all the characters. They're all trying to answer the question of what it means to live in a highly political world, right? There's the kings, and there's Holofernes, who, though he's the villain here, is really just doing his master's bidding and defending his nation. And there's Achior, who's trying to figure out how to speak truth to power, and there's the city councilors who are trying to respond to the will and the needs of the people as best they can, and then there's Judith, who kind of cunningly is working to offer God an opportunity to save her townspeople. And I think about how Judith and all these other folks had to figure out how to be a person of faith and a citizen of her nation at the same time. Right? Her conversation with the leadership of her town addresses that exactly, the question of how to balance our spiritual beliefs and our communal interests, our certainties and our fears. Seems like in her time, as well as in our own, being a citizen of heaven and earth at the same time has taken thoughtfulness and humility and a huge dose of courage. You know, I look ahead and I think we're going to need this kind of witness and others like it as we continue into another cycle of our own political movements. And as we too at times feel besieged by the forces we feel are against us. And I think there's some wisdom actually I take specifically from this tale. First is that there's a difference between believing God is with us and believing God is on our side. To believe God is on our side unequivocally eschews the thoughtfulness, introspection, and discernment that a life of faith demands. And it can easily lead us down a slippery slope on which God's values and priorities look exclusively like our own. But to believe that God is with us is a bit different. Believing God is with us can give us courage to do the best we can, the strength to press on in difficult circumstances. It can also embed in us the humility which being faithful to God requires. So there's a difference between those two things. I would say a second learning is that one must carefully avoid the all or nothing mindset that dire situations often push us toward. Like, we're giving God 5 days and then we're giving up, right? It's like either God does all of what we want, everything we want, or we throw in the towel. I think some of us feel like that sometimes, right? Is it even worth it to engage and do the discernment and the advocacy? But I think the story of Judas is clear that that way of despair is self-defeating. And rather, one must have faith. There is always work to do for God's kingdom, no matter the circumstances. And that focusing on the real needs in front of us and the real gifts we've been given will never be fruitless. Lastly, I think a lesson that I see reflected here in a few other places in the stories we visited is that righteousness within is related to success without. You know, the story of Judas models the connection between internal piety and external action. We don't talk about piety a lot in the church, but that's clearly at work in this story. Right, the first thing she does before she goes on her campaign is pray and fast and commune with God, and then she goes. And I think this pattern has serious implications on a variety of levels, right? Personal, communal. I think it implies that vigilant attention to and responsibility for what's happening in our own souls, in our own houses, in our own communities is related to our capacity to interact fruitfully with others, other people, other faiths. I think it means we can never stop assessing the work that is necessary within us and in our own spheres as we imagine what endeavors we are summoning us beyond our borders. So there are a few things I hope you would add more hearing this. I hope you enjoyed listening to Judith and to this entire series. I hope it's almost as though now you're walking away from the campfire to go back to your tent, right? And I hope this time of gathering that you will feel the resonance of some of these tales with you on the trails wherever you go. And as always, I will hope that the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always will be here in these words and within each of us. And to conclude our series, we're going to sing a song